Hey, welcome, welcome, welcome here to our Mars and Adesso webinar. Great that all you're here tonight. We have today, or tonight actually, a wonderful topic about the money time with health apps. But before we come into the money time, just let me tell you a little bit about Mars and Adesso. So tonight our webinar is with Dr. Stefan Walzer. My name is Lutz Vollmer. I'm your moderator today. And also we have here from Adesso, the lead of the Competence Center Digital Health, Yvonne Gruendler. Wonderful.
Hi.
So, and all of there here in what is Mars, or what are we doing here at Mars? Mars is the market access and pricing strategy agency. We're a consultant agency, and we have all the topics here in pricing and reimbursement strategy for Germany, Austria, and Switzerland. So any questions you have about here, pricing and reimbursement, our market access, we are your partner there. We also do all your calculations for the health economics. And also if you have any questions about reimbursement submissions, so all the paperwork for the German Federal Joint Committee, the GBA, are here, like tonight, with a BfArM Diga process, the digital health applications, or also with the Swiss BAG or the Austrian Hauptverband. We do all that application paperwork and also find your way through that exciting market access jungle here. Also, well, what is pretty cool, we have now negotiation support. So if we, and that's also a topic left for later, right? We have here a nice virtual reality bootcamp where we have like the newest digital technology for you, just to prepare you ideally with the newest concept here of also that VR education things for your price negotiations. And of course, as experts in market access, we have a wonderful webinar series, but also here, check out our podcast, our market access podcast, the one and only. And there's really exciting things there you can listen to. It's all available on the iOS podcast or the Android podcast channels there, and check out the episodes with Renato Della Mano, our good friend Renato, and with the art and science of the pricing. And also, you want to check that out, how to fight well. It's about the drug negotiations, but that's also good when you want to check out a little bit about the pricing here in the Diga procedure. And of course, we have a wonderful episode with Professor Dr. Jürgen Wasem, who's the head of the Vollmer arbitration board for drugs. And he's now actually the head of the arbitration board for the digital health apps, so for the DiGAs. So, and Stefan is discussing with him in the podcast what happens when negotiation falls, what happens here in the arbitration board. So good educational series, all on Mars, Apple, Spotify, and Amazon. And of course, we are here. This is an interactive webinar, so your questions are welcome. Feel free to ask questions. We have a short presentation, and after that, we have plenty of time for your questions. So you can use either the Zoom chat function or the question and answer function here in Zoom to raise your questions or comments. And as always, slides and the whole webinar will be published on our website, which brings me to the next slide, which is if you check out our website, www.marketaccess-pricingstrategy.de, there you find up there with a yellow arrow, the webinar section where you find all the different webinars we had in the past. Also another one with Jürgen Wasem about the arbitration board, but also about pricing, or here the one with the AMNOG impact on European countries, where we also have like the market access for Europe. So check that out, it's a wonderful educational source. And of course, all webinars are actually listed on YouTube, so you can actually subscribe to our YouTube channel and find also the webinars in our YouTube channel. But let's come tonight here. We have today the founder of Mars, Stefan Walzer, who's a health economist, worked for a long time for Roche, and who's now the CEO of the Market Access and Pricing Strategy. Welcome to Weil am Rhein. Hello, Stefan.
Hi, Lutz. Thank you for the introduction, and also big thank you,
Yvonne, that you join us tonight. So looking forward already to good presentation and good discussion afterwards.
Yeah, and then Stefan introduced her, Yvonne Gruendler, who's the lead of the Competence Center Digital Health from Adesso. Adesso, a wonderful big IT company, but that's actually your place, Yvonne, here, Adesso.
So thanks very much for having me tonight. I'm very excited about hearing more about pricing. Maybe just a few words on Adesso. As you mentioned already, we're an IT service provider and IT consulting company based in Germany with a lot of different lines of businesses, including health. And very specifically there, we have a department called personal health and digital health, which is the area that I work for. We have a select few B2B products also in this area, which I'll actually come to in a second. Maybe if you go forward one slide. So maybe we thought we could start off the webinar with a little interactive session, because if everyone here already knows what a Diga is, I can actually skip this slide quickly. Maybe we could run the poll quickly to see where you guys are actually at in your Diga journey. So the question is, how far along are you becoming a Diga? So first answer is we already have a Diga. Second one, we have a health app and want to become a Diga, or we are gathering information on how to become a Diga. And obviously, you know, if all of you had answered, we already have a Diga, then I'll skip this part. But yeah, if you just take a quick moment to answer, then we'll know where everyone is at. And I think we're 6 out of 7. One last person. Don't be shy. Nothing to lose here. Although at the bottom it does say 6, so maybe it is 6. I'm not quite sure.
Okay. So we have actually 100% thank you all for having that there. So Yvonne, actually, we are gathering information on how to become a Diga is our favor start here. Okay, so I'll close the poll.
Then I will actually run through this slide very quickly, just to make sure that we are all starting on the same page. So DiGAs, or digitale Gesundheitsanwendungen, as they're called nicely in Germany, basically digital health applications, are digital helpers that are in the hand of the patient. They're also very fondly called apps on prescription by the people who are working in this area, as the doctors prescribe the app, or the health insurance provides code on request to activate the app. They have to be a medical device, and that's in the classes of 1 or 2A. Most of them actually are 2A under NDR. And they have to provide evidence of a positive care effect. And that can either be medical use or patient-relevant improvement of structure and processes. And there's a whole variety of sub-definitions and categories, for example, improvement of your health competency or quicker access to care. If you want to have more information on that, you know, you can talk to me later, or we can talk offline. I can provide that list. What's really important is that Diga does not provide primary prevention. That excludes a digital health application from becoming a Diga. And the inclusion in the Diga catalog is upon successful application with the BfArM, which is the Federal Institute for Drugs and Medical Devices. So the whole program has been running for just about 1.5 years now. But the data is from November 2021. That was the last time the data was published, and about 40,000 DiGAs have been prescribed by them with an average price of 405 euros per quarter per prescription. Obviously, that's the interesting part, which we'll be getting to shortly as well, how you can make sure that that price stays high. Very briefly, 3 main categories that you need to achieve to become a Diga. One is regulation conform technology. One is becoming a certified medical device, and then you have to provide this evidence of a positive care effect. As Adesso mentioned earlier, we also provide B2B products. So we actually have something called the Diga Estica to help you along your way in terms of the regulation conform technology. So it's basically a modular low-code platform that you can use to quickly build your Diga, so you don't have to worry about all the different things that you might need to meet, all the different requirements that you might need to meet, and can actually focus on building the best patient experience. It's modular, so you can pick and choose and really use the elements that you want to use. So depending on what you already have in terms of technology, you can opt to use certain components and exclude other components. You could go to the next slide, please. So the Diga provider journey, starting from concept, intended use, moving on to regulation conform technology, and then the medical device certification, providing evidence of positive care effect. Then you go to the BfArM to get included in the Diga catalog, and then you start marketing the Diga to both healthcare providers as well as patients. The Diga then gets prescribed, and finally you have the billing, which is obviously the interesting part. You see the billing is at the, in inverted commas, end of the journey, but actually in terms of setting the price to be able to bill the social health insurances, you need to be thinking about this entire journey and different aspects. And that's what we are here to talk about today. What are the top mistakes that we see Diga providers making at this point in time? How can you avoid them, and how you can ensure that you set your pricing in a smart way and ensure that you have a long-lasting high price? And with that, I'd hand over to Lutz and Stefan.
Thank you, Yvonne. Wonderful. Yes, Stefan, so we are coming now to the money time, right?
Yes.
First we have here that wonderful process of a preliminary inclusion in the Diga directory. Is it an endless story, or?
I would rather agree with what Yvonne said at the very end, right? I mean, pricing might come at the end, let's say, of the development process, because it's the start of the commercialization. However, obviously pricing and the strategy and setting the price needs obviously to be, or let's say to start probably a lot earlier. So the idea is really here just to set a bit the kind of scene, especially also in the kind of context we are, right? Because I mean, we all said already, we're speaking about a Diga. I think we have heard what a Diga is. I think most of you might already anyway know what a Diga is, but it's also obviously around in which kind of setting are we really discussing about the price. And that's where, very briefly, I will not go now through that slide, but it shows you basically already that there are different processes in order to be, let's say, firstly, BfArM listed, which is then obviously the kind of start, obviously, how to get them into the price negotiation afterwards. So there is then a preliminary kind of pathway when, let's say, the evidence is not yet sufficiently, let's say, provided to the BfArM, and obviously the kind of, let's say, final inclusion, either that you have provided it through that preliminary kind of pathway or directly potentially to the BfArM. So next slide, please. Okay, so also there, I think keeping in mind, and I think that's ultimately very similar to obviously what we know from drug pricing, what does really drive the kind of argumentation of a price? Besides other kind of components we're coming to in a couple of minutes, it's quite clearly, let's see, the value around it. And the value is basically clearly defined as well already in the BfArM, or let's call it probably better, Diga pathway, where you could basically show a positive care effect on the medical side, so medical benefit, for example, overall survival or similar, and or also in terms of improvement of patient-relevant processes. I think that's just the kind of, let's say, two different components, and where I think coming obviously from the drug area, firstly, before we were obviously as already since a couple of years working also in the digital health area, the patient-relevant process is at least also already included there. It will be interesting to see once a product, a Diga, would maybe only show an improvement of a patient-relevant process, is that if that really as well makes it to an attractive price, and also if it might be even acceptable by the BfArM. So let's just see. I'm a bit skeptical on that. I think the end I can believe. I think we've seen that already, but the or is maybe a bit of a question mark, which obviously as well would then have an impact on the pricing. But where are we now? I mean, currently, I think the kind of idea was really as well, not only showing obviously what we have seen, maybe with some of the already approved Digas. We have now 30 Digas on the BfArM list, which I think is a good number. I think some were maybe a bit disappointed. We're expecting a couple of more, but I think having, let's say, seen such a kind of process and a pathway now just since, yeah, what is it now? Close to 2 years. I think it's a quite good kind of process. I think we have seen a couple of, let's say, homeworks and the kind of feedback to the Diga companies, also learning basically how to probably also improve their kind of pathway to the BFAM. But I think it's not only, let's say, led to those, right? I think some of those, I personally think, have done a good kind of pricing, and obviously and clearly for most of those, we can only see it from outside, right? There are a lot of other kind of drivers on pricing, which is, for example, sometimes also investors, the kind of portfolio, et cetera, et cetera. So it's just more the general view, what we think out of those, but also out of other potential Diga companies coming to the market soon, or maybe never, but what we have just seen in discussions the last couple of months and, yeah, roughly 2 years from now. Next slide, please. Okay, so what is it really, right? I mean, we have the 30 Digas, sounds interesting, and we had a lot of discussions also with digital health companies from the US, from Australia, and some other parts of the world. And I mean, their first question was always, the pathway sounds great, but what is the ultimate outcome, what we can really expect from a pricing perspective? And then, I mean, you see it here. I mean, interestingly, if you just start maybe with the third bullet, if you don't want to really pin it out of the figure on the right-hand side, but the prices vary quite hugely, right? I mean, the lowest one is just 119 euros for a quarter. And that even, keep it in mind, before being negotiated. Maybe put that a bit in brackets. I think that product, at least to our knowledge, has as well a selective contract in place. So we'll see how this is then really being further negotiated within the GKV SV, or whether this is still seen as a kind of final price, because this as a launch price, let's say, I can hardly probably understand the strategy. I mean, but let's just see, right? It's just one component. On the other hand, you have a product which, I mean, you see it on the right-hand figure as well. They're basically a bit of two outliers, I would say. Both basically a bit above the 700 euros per quarter. I think that sounds already quite interesting. Also, when we have spoken to, let's say, companies, especially from the US, I think they were hoping at least to have a final price. So after negotiations, let's say around or hopefully also above the 800 euros per quarter. So that's also where you see, I think, the prices, I would say, let's just see. I was also expecting a bit more, but let's just see what we'll really get out there finally after the negotiations. And we also see politically, obviously, especially obviously pushed by the health insurance funds, by the head association of the health insurance funds. They also want to push those prices even further down. That's, I think, quite clear. I think I would even say the mandate is there to really try to push it as close as possible to the kind of Play stores and app stores of the world. However, let's just see what we can basically potentially even do better. I mean, on top of what you see here, which are just the launch prices, we have now also, let's say, the first negotiated price, which is the one of Somnia, the first negotiated, and especially also out of the arbitration board, where I think it might be especially the interesting case to also get further kind of insights how the price might potentially be, let's say, seen and built out of the GKV SV direction and work quite clearly out of the arbitration board. Having said that, we know how Professor Walzer was acting in the drug area, and I think if we follow that first decision, it sounds quite familiar, I would say. So let's just see where we go there. So we've said that already. I think the most important point of that arbitration board decision was, I think, what you have probably also seen, and most of you have at least seen in the press, is that there was a 50% discount of the launch price, which is, let's put that away, really high, I would say. On the other hand, I think it was, at least not for me, a surprise that the first case, maybe also the other cases, might go to the arbitration board. I think the direction of the health insurance side, I think, is quite clear, to really push the prices of the Diga area really down to a level they would potentially still see, let's say, acceptable. I would still say, just a feeling out of other discussions, but I would still say even that 50% price is not what the GKV wanted to really have. I think they wanted to have it probably even lower. And just imagine, this was the arbitration board kind of decision, right? Just imagine where the health insurance funds were probably offering a price which I think was close to clearly not acceptable. I think especially also when having been maybe in the shoes of Memento. Next slide, please. So what is the setting? Also, before we come to the, let's say, the potential mistakes, also having that in mind, we have basically three negotiations. There's the possibility of a fourth one, which need to be then happening within a 6-month period. I think that's important. I think the kind of negotiations happen basically within a 4 hours time frame. Within those 4 hours, you can basically discuss the various parts here, but it's also very important. You see that probably also in one of the slides with the mistakes. One of the components and parts of that discussion, which is a big difference to the drug area, is that also the clinical benefit is being discussed. I mean, within the drug area, this is being discussed in a separate process by the Joint Federal Committee, by the GBA. Here, the BfArM is not discussing about basically the benefit and the added benefit, right? They just say it's sufficient to be included for a BfArM listing. So the product is a Diga in a way, but it doesn't say anything about the benefit or the added benefit. This is then being done also during the price negotiation. That I think is a real hard tool, especially, and a good tool probably when coming from the health insurance side. Just very important to say as well here is obviously be prepared. I think be prepared sounds so odd in a way, but you need to be prepared really right from the beginning. I think don't lose even the first second in those negotiations. I mean, it might sound really a long time, 3 times 4 hours. Yes, it's 12 hours, but believe me, 3 days, 4 hours is not a lot of time. I mean, you need to, let's say, bring everybody to the same table, on the same page, and then you basically still need to differentiate before you can come together. It's just a logic of negotiation, which is, I think, quite hard to achieve also within those, let's say, 12 hours. But I think, again, I think this kind of part out of a football game, I think is showing exactly, be concentrated from the beginning. So let's maybe just quickly show it. So you saw, I mean, what I meant basically, be prepared from the early beginnings, right? I mean, you could make mistakes, obviously directly in the first kind of negotiation minute, but I think some of the mistakes might even potentially be, let's say, happening a bit earlier. I think very important also what could be seen as potential price anchors. And that's maybe as well a bit basic, but I think it's important to mention. For DiGAs, and this is obviously just an example, right? There could be others, and it depends heavily on the Diga itself, but there could be other drug therapies which could be seen as a price anchor, non-drug therapies for sure, as well, different procedures, physician visits, if there's maybe a substitute or maybe an add-on to physician visits, absenteeism, for example, in your work life. I think that could be an interesting kind of price anchor. Follow-up costs, so that means what happens in terms of patient pathway. For example, is there an additional psychotherapy needed in case of complications, etc. But also, and importantly, what you see here on the left-hand side then is out-of-pocket costs. Is there anything like a direct to patient sales in Germany, but also in other countries, and quite clearly also prices of your DiGAs, at least in other European countries. EU countries is, let's say, pretty much the driver, but also, and for sure, and especially if the price is quite low, also including Switzerland. I think that's as well what I think was one of the feedback and the kind of important information we have also seen from the arbitration board decision on Somnio. Okay, let's go to the kind of, let's say, I would rather say top mistakes. I think there might be even further, right? But I think that's at least something what we have as well seen in the last 1.5 to 2 years. I think the first mistake is on the clinical evidence base. I think it's very important, and the arbitration board said that as well again. We've always, let's say, seen that. I mean, in the BfArM guide, it's not a must that you need to have a randomized controlled trial as an evidence base. I think it only says it should at least be retrospective. However, most of the DiGAs which are now listed have either provided an RCT and or are now running an RCT in order to then being listed permanently, which I personally think is good, right? But it might depend also a bit on the environment. However, just keep in mind that RCT is not always what saves you an attractive and optimized price. I think this is just an example of what I just put in there, even from the drug area. This was a product in breast cancer, and that product has shown a significant, statistically significant overall survival benefit, but it still didn't get an additional benefit. It was still an RCT, right? I think it was a high quality RCT, but there were a couple of other pitfalls. So that's just, next slide, please, Lutz. Let's just keep it in mind. There is no perfect study available. Never, ever. There are always pitfalls. There are always, let's say, critiques on also randomized controlled trials. So that's also where you need always to be prepared to go into such kind of discussions. So the criticism on your study. And also important, how does the GKVSC, so the other side, let's say, of the table, the head association of the statutory health insurance funds do that? They basically ask their, let's say, internal assessment body, which in this case is the MDS, for their assessment. And just guess, they normally do those kind of assessments when checking different medical devices and also other areas. And I could say, maybe a bit provocative, just guess what the outcome is. Obviously, it's for the preparation of the price negotiation from their side. So it is, of course, evidence-based. Of course, they're checking the kind of rules from that side, but it's quite clear it's getting really hard and tough in those kind of discussions. So as a kind of recommendation, because a study is a lot of times already, let's say, available, right? So independent, if you need to plan then and execute a high quality clinical study, at least before you go into the price negotiations, have a critical review. We were even saying critical health technology assessment of your clinical evidence base really in your pocket and know where your pitfalls and where your issues are. I think that's really, really important before you even start with your price negotiation. You see, this has basically, so far, nothing really to do directly with the price itself. It's just more how to either defend your price, or if you turn it, how to basically push it forward that your price is an acceptable and a quite, let's say, fair price, maybe also in the healthcare setting. Mistake 2 is maybe, I think that's probably one of my favorite discussions, also with drug companies, right? No worries about that. I think it might be maybe the kind of, call it wrong price anchor. The kind of issue is obviously always, what is the right price anchor, right? I mean, we can all discuss and maybe see and find different anchors what might potentially be fair, but maybe not. But I think it's important for you keeping that again in mind of the negotiation, and especially when it comes, maybe we put it in there as a face-to-face negotiation, which might also happen currently in the digital phases, right? That just the kind of negotiation leads are speaking to each other. But I can promise you, one of the very first questions they will ask you, maybe even patiently and nicely ask you, is basically, I do not understand your price rationale. Can you please explain? That's for sure, because they want to understand, obviously, where they can tackle, where they can basically go against you. But for sure, they also want to see where maybe the holes might potentially be, where they can as well then basically be pushed in there. I think it's important keeping in mind there as well. I think it's just a general kind of path, right? What you see here, and the kind of price which is then linked to each other, and the GKVS what we put in there will never probably agree to that. But when you have a look and analyze the different arbitration boards as well, I think it always, let's say, goes into similar kind of direction, right? One box is obviously monetarization of the added benefit. So how much is it really worth your added benefit in a way from your, let's say, clinical evidence? Then there's the second box, which is the current kind of care cost. So how much does the current care of patient costs? So obviously, current care is at the level of that. If you have an added benefit, there needs to be something on top. So then you have the first two. And the third one is then European, or let's call it maybe abroad prices. We put in there for the Diga part, obviously, as well, the out-of-pocket prices. So that's just keeping something in mind where you need as well to think a bit beforehand. Doesn't mean that this is your path, how you build your price, right? But ultimately, you need to understand where potentially the GKVSV might come into those kind of discussions. Next slide, please. So as a kind of recommendation, get your price rationale clear for yourself. I think that's very important, right? It sounds, again, quite odd, but I mean, we have seen a lot of persons, negotiation team members, negotiation leads, where some of those really had difficulties to explain in very simple words how they basically came up with the price. I mean, they could not just simply say the CEO told me, right? There needs to be a kind of rationale, right? Why was that price basically being chosen? And for sure, be able to pass the right face test with that rationale, because that's ultimately what you need anyway to prepare. But finally, it's also cross-check your rationale. So how you came up with it. It could be any other kind of rationale. We have done a lot of different, let's say, strategies with different kind of rationales, but it needs to resonate to the logic of the payer side, obviously. So you need to find a way, at least, where you could, let's say, combine it away from an argumentations perspective, because that might also be an important component when it might potentially then also go into the arbitration board. Next slide, please. Mistake 3. The first two might still maybe sound quite clear, I think. The third, and I think also the fourth one, as far as I remember, might maybe not be the direct kind of, let's say, mistakes you have maybe had in mind, at least when thinking about DiGAs as well, right? Fast sales directly to patients. I mean, we know, and we're working with a lot of, let's say, startup companies in the early phase, and we know that it might be difficult because maybe investors, but also maybe, let's say, management board is pushing to get sales rather earlier than later. And for sure, there's always the kind of, let's say, push and the opportunity maybe to directly find a pathway to sell the Diga, so meaning more the digital health solution to the patient. The kind of important, let's say, advantages are quite clear. It's fast and easy access, and for sure, direct turnover, which I think is also quite clear. However, don't try to explain to any kind of healthcare payer why they would need to pay more than what you charge to a patient, right? It's very hard for them to understand. And to be honest, I could understand them at least a bit, right? They see themselves basically as their watchdogs of the German healthcare insurance premiums, and hence they basically want to make sure in their
Okay, I think we just lost Stefan, and here he's back.
You know, Lutz, it looks that whenever we have a webinar on digital health, my internet connection is not working, at least in the middle of the presentation. We had that as well a year ago, but now I'm back. So what I just want to say is basically, you know, there are potentially good reasons for a direct, let's say, sales to patient, but just keep thinking what this could harm in a way as well for your price to the, let's say, in Germany to the statutory health insurance payers, right? So if you want to follow the Diga pathway, my kind of question is really always, why the hell should you directly pay to patients? Because the pathway to the BfArM is, let's put it that way, quite simple. I mean, if you make your homework right, if you put a good kind of at least just a pilot study together, you are in that, let's say, BfArM listing already quite fast. And then you have direct access and reimbursement by the health insurance fund. So why the hell should you pay directly to patients? Just keep it in mind. There might be other reasons for sure, but this is an important consideration. Okay, mistake number 4 is a very similar one, probably to the one we have just spoken about, which is then the, let's say, the sales directly to patient. And this way, it's maybe you can call it as well sales to the direct sales to health insurance funds. I mean, it's a selective contract. It was the pathway before the Diga, let's say, path was introduced. The Diga law was passed. I think that was for sure, and that was, I think, a good kind of pathway as well. It was basically probably the only way a lot of times. But I think again, it's the same kind of question beforehand, right? I mean, why do you want to approach a health insurance company beforehand, make a selective contract, but still go the Diga pathway? I mean, firstly, also to mention, a lot of health insurance companies are not really keen anymore to sign a selective contract, especially if they see maybe a Diga being a Diga. However, I would rather say there are also in the kind of current Digas now on the market, at least one or the other example where I could maybe also interpret the price and the product with a selective contract as maybe as well a push from the health insurances in order, let's say, to bring the prices further down in that kind of area of Diga. So that's as well something keeping in mind. And for sure, just keep in mind, the price you have agreed with the health insurance fund will just be the maximum price you will ever get. Because from the payer's perspective, it's very simple. If you go into the Diga part, you expand significantly your patient pool, and hence the price needs to go down, right? This is the kind of normal logic the payers will always tell you. So that's just keep it in mind. If you go the pathway for whatever reasons, just keep in mind as well that the price should at least be, let's say, above the expected price, what you want to have from the Diga pathway. So be cautious. Mistake 5, just keep in mind, and you see that as well, obviously, when you have a look, let's say, also in the drug area, for example, but also when you read the arbitration board decision on Somnio, for sure, European prices from abroad are being taken into consideration. One of the core reasons why, for example, AMNOG, that is the health assessment, let's say, process in the drug area was introduced, was the kind of reason why Germans should pay more for the drugs than their neighbors around, right? Like in France or wherever. That was the core reason. And I mean, this is still what you get basically back when you are in negotiations from the payer side, right? I mean, why the hell should Germans pay more than Danish patients or French patients or even Polish patients or whatever, right? I think that's just an important consideration. When then keeping in mind, again, how I would still say quite easy the Diga pathway is. I would always put, obviously, let's say the Diga pathway in forefront, and maybe just think maybe other countries later on. For sure, you need to still keep in mind that revenue needs to be right, quite clear. You need to as well keep in mind, if you only, let's say, be at, let's say, preliminary being listed in the BfArM, it takes quite a while until you have your price negotiations in Germany. So that might as well be the kind of tricky part where you just say, look, I am preliminary listed. I have as well my Diga study, which is currently running, and I still need, let's say, still a bit more than 1.5 years until I have my negotiated price. So I would still need to increase somehow my revenues, maybe also in other countries. All good? For sure, there are those kind of reasons. But again, also there, just keep in mind where you can as well get a quite attractive price, or maybe at least keep thinking which kind of discounts are really possible. I think especially in the Diga way, I think there might be some quite interesting risk share kind of agreements possible, because you automatically anyway, let's say, collect data, right? So that is as well something keeping in mind. And that's also where the sequencing of a launch is very important. I mean, we still see some companies approaching us and just saying, look, we have just launched our Diga in, I don't know, for example, in the UK and France and in Sweden. Now we want to go to Germany. I mean, my first question is always, why did you already launch in those other countries? And guess what? They don't have an answer. So if you launch, keep thinking also where the pathway might be attractive, where you could also potentially then get an attractive price. For sure, if you get an attractive price outside of Germany, and you could maybe just say the German price might be anyway lower because you have just seen what I have shown in the early beginnings. I mean, it might still be a kind of pathway, but I think those are already, let's say, the kind of 5 mistakes which I think could be avoided quite easily when you think early, when you think strategically. And I think it's also, let's say, parts where they, or let's say these kind of mistakes should also still be taken into considerations when you plan your negotiation strategy. So if something went wrong for whatever reasons, just keep thinking how to potentially, let's say, work with those kind of, let's say, issues at the end of the day. Okay, Lutz, I think my last slide as a kind of summary, which is for sure, think early and strategically on your Diga pricing and try to avoid mistakes. I mean, you have seen the arbitration board decision on Somnio. It was just an anchor, right, to do the kind of, let's say, presentation here. Think about how the payers as well put the prices together, and finally also keep that into the kind of setting where the DiGAs will being negotiated. I think that was it in a way, Lutz. Thank you also for the introduction, Yvonne. I think that put a quite nice frame around it. So let's see if we get any further kind of questions.
Wonderful. Thank you, Stefan. And thank you, Yvonne, also for the interaction. Great. It's money time, right? We want to look for the money, and also our audience is quite keen. There are a lot of questions here. So let's start with the one question about the clinical evidence, the clinical trials. I mean, that's also a lot of our clients are asking, and what is always like a discussion also when you go to the BfArM for a consultation before your submission. And the question is, well, how is it about with clinical evidence from another country? So, can you leverage from clinical trial results from another country to justify a medical benefit? Stefan.
Yes, Lutz, I think I can still remember, I think it was probably one of the very first discussions with the BfArM we had directly after the Diga introduction, where we had I mean, I personally think it was a really great study. It was an RCT, it was large RCT, it was in an oncology area. It was done not in Germany, it was outside of Germany, and it was even showing an overall survival benefit. So I think, to me, I think this was quite logic that the BfArM needed to accept that evidence base. But I think it took us, I think, 3 consultations with that same study that they basically more or less, let's say, found a political way how to accept it. But I think what I want to say, I think it's probably really important to see also a bit the differences to the drug area, right? I think in drug area, I think it's standard that also, let's say, evidence from outside of Germany is being accepted for sure. I mean, otherwise big, large RCTs are probably not even able to be run. In the Diga area, I mean, just keep in mind how some of those Digas as well being created, right? A lot of those Digas have, let's say, explanations, patient videos, and also questionnaires around, right? For example, quality of life questionnaires or anything like that, where obviously the kind of language bit is a very important consideration. So that is, I think, where the Diga is especially looking for. And I think one of the kind of, let's say, pathways or maybe bridges where also the BfArM was trying then, let's say, to build upon with some of the Diga companies was also just to say, especially if the RCT was a high quality one, that they just said, look, maybe just do a language validation, right? A language validation of, let's call it the Diga from the other country into the German Diga. I think that's an important point where I think you could probably also lever quite nicely from clinical trials from outside of Germany.
But is it also something to do with the context, how the care takes place, the standard of care?
For sure. Absolutely. I think that's another component. Absolutely right, Lutz. I think one is for sure, I mean, how those Digas are being built. But the second part is also, I mean, whether it's maybe the kind of comparator, which sometimes goes into that kind of direction, but a lot of times it's also anyway just the underlying care, right? I mean, just keep in mind, I mean, if make it maybe, let's say in that way, I mean, the US environment might be even quite different to the German environment, right? But just keep maybe in mind further, what about if you just have maybe a study run in, I don't know, maybe in South Africa, versus Germany, or maybe, I mean, we had that discussion, let's remember, maybe in Poland, right? the underlying care might not be so different to Germany, but you need to prove it. I think that's important, and you need to prove it, starting with this, for example, treatment guidelines, from the availability, for example, also of underlying drugs or therapies, psychotherapies, for example, etc. So that is an important consideration. So you need to show that whatever you have shown and proven in one country is, let's say, comparable into the German care context, especially obviously if you want to go into the permanent listing. I mean, otherwise you could as well just say, look, there's a proof, we have a language validation, you might potentially then be included into the preliminary listing. But then you obviously need to keep in mind, you need to still invest some further budget for another German Diga study.
Yeah, and keeping in mind, Europe is not the United States of Europe. It's 27 different countries, right? So if you look, for example, to our lovely neighbors from the Netherlands, we laugh at every soccer world championship. There are like some parts are really completely different from inpatient, outpatient settings, or even like with specialized care centers, right? Where we absolutely do not have here in Germany, but the Dutch have here a really professional level. But having their trial set in that professional level, that is just a complete different setting than the one in Germany. So you really want to have here a close look on it. So, but we have some more questions here. So, and that's probably also a question to Yvonne. What must a Diga actually to be able to do in order to survive on the market?
So in terms of being able to survive on the market, I think, like many other digital products, it needs to provide some kind of USP and some kind of differentiation, right? What we're seeing at the moment in terms of DiGAs is that there's a high concentration in the area of mental health, which makes sense, right? Because first of all, the pandemic, so there's a lot of like additional need. Secondly, it's an area which in Germany is where the waiting times traditionally have always been very long. There's the resources in terms of therapy spots for patients are very low, and so people have to wait for a long time. So naturally, it's an area that the Diga developers went into. And if you start looking at the Digas, you might start thinking, well, what's the difference between this Diga for depression and this Diga for depression, and then also this Diga for depression? That's also something that, in terms of pricing is very interesting, because what we've seen in terms of the calculations for Digas, they're being grouped into different disease groupings. And so that comparison is starting to be made. So medium, long term, I definitely would think about what really is the USP of our Diga. How are we going to continue developing the product in a regulation conform way, right? So don't forget that every time you change, you still have to up your regulatory requirements or keep up with your regulatory requirements to be able to keep that value, provide that additional value to the patient, to the health insurances as well, so that you can keep that pricing high.
Yeah. Now, I would maybe add just to what Yvonne said, and I fully agree with you. I think it's probably also just the kind of basics, right? Physicians need to prescribe it. I think that's currently still, let's say, I would rather say still a kind of issue, right? I mean,
Absolutely.
We have heard some physicians even just saying, look, I mean, with a drug, I can understand the mode of action, right? Because I studied it. But if I get a digital health application and I can just read what it should do, but I have never tried it, it might be maybe a bit difficult. So that's also maybe something for some of the Diga companies keeping in mind, that there might be maybe some ways to further lever on the experiences, I would rather say, maybe from the physician, that because they would as well need to not only recommend it to to patient, but also to prescribe it, right? So that's maybe as well something keeping in mind. Besides, for sure, you need to have that kind of differentiation factor, etc. I fully agree.
Yeah, it's really interesting on the part on prescription, right? You're absolutely right. Traditionally 1 year, right? The Diga market is not very long, but from the Digas that are on the market at the time being, they've come out of a context which is not used to marketing to health professionals. So obviously there are consultancies, there are there's support out there, including little sales pitch, adesso as well, where we can help you to do your medical marketing, to really speak to the right doctors, to convince them, to provide the materials as well, right? Continuous medical education, et cetera, so that much in the way that pharma actually distributes their products, this product as digital medicine is also distributed to healthcare professionals. There's also a very interesting second route, which I think DiGA providers so far are not fully utilizing it. And to be honest, I don't know why. And that's the route directly to the patients. So imagine you have an app which has a mass market, let's say obesity, right? Or smoking cessation. You can actually, very classically market your product digitally straight to the patient, and then combine a telemedicine provider into it, also a digital experience. So they don't even have to go to a doctor physically, right? Get their attestation, and then with that, go to their health insurance to get their code. And so far, we're not really seeing the providers make use of that, even though, the pathway is open to do that. And it would be a very elegant way to help the patient move through that process. There's a slight media break between that attestation and then getting that to the health insurance. But apart from that, it's a very digital journey, right, that you could provide there. So that's something that, those digital marketing skills can be put to use here as well.
Yeah, and that's especially in an environment where most of the physicians, especially the general practitioners here in the countryside, right? They are like aging 50, 60, or even older, right? Yeah. It's hard to find someone who actually take over their work, and then they're using fax machines, right? Still, so there's no digitalization, and I mean, they are not the expert for digitalization, and a lot of them just say, well, this is not our investment. So it's, I mean, it's somehow bothering them, right? Go there as a patient and say, hey, doctor, I really like you, but I want to have now that digital app. And they say, well, okay, but I have no clue out of that. So totally understandable. And that's a really wonderful idea also to bridge that situation, right? Because there is a proof of the clinical concept actually there, especially, I mean, there's the pathway, the preliminary pathway where you like get access on that, where so the DiGA provider, you have a 1 year preliminary listing, but then you already have to get in there to prove a hint that you have a medical or a patient relevant structural and procedural improvement. So, and that is also from our audience coming a next question. Would it be more interesting for a company to develop a DiGA that has a medical benefit, or would it be better to facilitate on a patient relevant structural and procedural improvement? Stefan and Yvonne. That's a tricky one, right?
So this is a really interesting question, and we're actually discussing that with a potential DiGA provider at this point in time. Let's put it this way. If you actually look at the DiGAs that are listed in a DiGA catalog, every single one of them so far, except for one, has as their first positive care effect a medical benefit. Right? So that already kind of tells you what direction it's going in. A lot of them, as their kind of secondary benefit, and with the endpoints that they're using in our study, does provide patient-relevant structural and procedural improvement, but not as their first one. And the one app that actually has it listed as there's only one endpoint, and it is PSVV, patient-relevant structural and procedural improvement. The way that they describe the improvement that they're making and what they're actually doing, you could actually argue that it's secondary prevention and not increasing health literacy, and therefore, again, has more a medical use as well. And even the way they've set up, because they've gone into the catalog preliminary, so they're collecting data at the moment, but the way that they've set up their study, to me, is very rigorous, right? So even though technically they're not claiming a medical benefit, I think you could argue that there still is a medical benefit if I had to bet and I could decide, and the Diga could go either way, to be safe, I would at this point probably go for the medical benefit, right? Just because it's still early days.
I would fully agree. I think, Yvonne, if I would need to decide on, I think that the safer way is to at least have also a medical benefit, because we also don't know yet really how, let's say, especially the payer side in the price negotiation will really react to only a structural or procedural kind of improvement. I mean, yes, of course, it's included in the Diga pathway, in the Diga, let's say, guide. And I think I would not see a major issue with the BfArM, I guess, but on the pricing side, I'm not sure if the GKV-SU would really see that as a major added benefit, and especially as the MDS would as well, let's say, evaluate the clinical parts of the evidence base of that. So I can only agree with you.
It's interesting, actually, Stefan, that you mentioned earlier also the launch sequence in terms of launching internationally. If you do go for a sequence where Germany as a high-priced country is first and then move into other countries, for example, France, which is planning to launch its own version of the Diga, I think that it would also be an extra additional benefit to go for the medical benefit, because from what I've heard so far, and it's not published yet, etc., right? So we don't 100% know, but the requirements on the clinical study part are even stricter in France. So if you want to go from Germany to France and take that benefit, have that also as a preliminary evidence, like you suggested earlier, to kind of prove your point in France, then I think the structural and procedural improvement might be more challenging in terms of internationalization.
Yes, yes. Another important consideration, absolutely, especially when thinking about, let's say, going global, or at least going Europe, right, with your Diga out of the German, let's say, world in a way. I can fully agree. Yeah, I would even say, yeah, probably in the UK they are a bit more pragmatic. I could guess. I mean, we know that also from other areas, but I think for most of the other countries, if we take again the European Union, maybe, then we're probably back to exactly what you have just said, to what is planned in France. Yeah, good point.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, both. It's already 10 o'clock. So, and actually, most questions have been done, and the other we are following there with you on LinkedIn, or we shoot you an email. So if you want to rewatch that webinar or the others, check out our webpage on market access -pricingstrategy.de. And thank you again, Yvonne, here for being here from adesso, our lead in the Competence Center Digital Health. Wonderful.
Thanks for having me. It was a lot of fun. Thank you.
Yeah. And also, Stefan, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Great webinar again about pricing. I mean, you just mentioned both France, right? We also have like our partner market access consultancies in France, in the MedVans group. So, and adesso, I know you have also trenches here all over Europe on the page. So if you want to be also there on a European strategy, check out our webpage or shoot us an email. Shoot Yvonne an email. Oh, there's let's point out again, check out our podcast, especially when negotiations fail, with Professor Dr. Jürgen Wasem about the arbitration board, who is now actually Professor Wasem, the head of the current digital or arbitration board for the digital health applications for the DiGAs. And also check out our Mars webinar series, where we have with our good friend from Italy, Dr. Renato Dellamano, actually next Thursday, same time, 9 o'clock in the evening here in Germany, which is 12 o'clock in San Francisco, so noon, high noon in San Francisco. So we don't have the art of war, we have the pricing strategy, and is it art or science? So if you want to dive in a little bit deeper in that topic, and then also in March we are talking about 2 years COVID-19, about the pandemic, what implication has that has also something to do with the DiGAs somehow, and then comes a more classical market access topic about with our good friend, Dr. Marcus Thalheimer from the University Clinics in Heidelberg, when we talk about the NUPS, which for some people or for some digital products could be also interesting. So thanks again, Yvonne. Thanks again, Stefan. And thanks again, dear lovely audience here, for having us tonight. Good night and good luck with your DiGAs.
Thank you all. Have a good evening. Bye.
Have a good evening. Bye.